The air at the Miller Estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the palpable greed of men looking to expand. It was 1973, and the corn was tall and the prices were even taller. You could almost smell the money in the humid Iowa air. I stood near the back, my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn denim jeans, feeling the familiar grit of dried soil under my fingernails. I wasn't here for land. I couldn't afford to be. I was here on the hunt for iron, for parts, for the forgotten and the overlooked. Up on the flatbed trailer, the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson with a sweat-stained Stetson, was working the crowd into a frenzy over the last and best parcel. 80 acres of prime, black dirt that bordered my own property to the west. My gut clenched. That was land my father had always dreamed of buying, land that would have squared off our holdings nicely. But dreams and $5 would get you a cup of coffee at the town diner and not much else. The bidding was a furious back and forth between two big operators from the next county and one man who stood head and shoulders above the rest, not in height, but in sheer, unadulterated confidence. Richard Davies. He'd come back to the county a few years ago after a stint at some fancy agricultural college, full of new ideas about leverage, cash flow, and economies of scale. He farmed with the bank's money, and he wasn't shy about it. He stood there, arms crossed over his chest, wearing a crisp, clean seed corn cap that looked like it had never seen a day of real work. He'd just taken delivery of a brand new International Harvester 1466, the kind with the Deluxe cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He'd driven it to the auction, parking it deliberately where the sun glinted off its perfect red paint, a monument to modern financed farming. 2100. I got 2100, now 2, now 22. Will you give me 2200? Henderson chanted, his voice a rhythmic, hypnotic drone. Davies just flicked a finger. No shouting, no excitement, just a casual, dismissive gesture that said the outcome was already decided. 2200 from Mr. Davies. Now 2300. The other bidders hesitated, looking at each other, then at Davies. They were done. He had deeper pockets, or at least his banker did. Sold for $2,200 an acre to Richard Davies. Henderson slammed his gavel down, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. It was a staggering price, a new record for the county. Davies just smiled, a thin, satisfied smirk, and shook the banker's hand, who was standing conveniently at his elbow. As the crowd began to break up, I made my way over to the miscellaneous equipment line, a sad collection of rust and faded paint that represented the bones of Old Man Miller's long life of toil. My eyes landed on what I'd come for, a new idea number 7 one-row corn picker. It was a museum piece, really, covered in rust, tires dry-rotted, the gathering chains seized solid. But I saw the good bones beneath the decay. I saw a gearbox that could be rebuilt, sprockets that could be sourced, a frame that was still true. For a man who ran 160 acres with a 1951 Farmall M and an Alice Chalmers all-crop 66 pull-type combine, a dedicated picker, even an old one, was a step up. I was running my hand over the pitted steel of the snapping rolls, feeling the weight of the metal, when a shadow fell over me. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. The smell of his fancy cologne cut through the honest sense of dust and oil. Still playing with toys, Jedediah? I straightened up slowly and turned to face Rich Davies. He was looking at the old picker, then at me, and his lip curled in a way that was half pity, half contempt. Can't feed the world with museum pieces, Stone. The game's changed. It's about volume now, gallons per hour, acres per day. This piece here doesn't come with a monthly payment, Rich, I said, my voice low and even. It doesn't care what the prime interest rate is. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. That's because it belongs in a scrapyard, not a cornfield. My new 1480 combine will shell more corn in an hour than that thing will in a week. You're living in the past. Your dad, he was a good man, but he farmed like it was still 1940. You're doing the same. You're going to get left behind. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt more like a shove. You ought to stop by the bank. Talk to Mr. Harris. He'll set you up. Get yourself some real equipment. It's the only way to survive. He walked away then, heading back toward his gleaming red tractor, the king of his new 80-acre acquisition. I watched him go, the anger in my belly a hot, familiar coal. He didn't get it. He saw my old iron as a weakness, a failure. He couldn't understand that for me, it was a strength. It was freedom. I went home empty-handed from the auction. Someone else, a hobby farmer with more sentiment than sense, paid $50 for the old picker. More than I was willing to part with. Back in my own workshop, the familiar smells of grease, diesel, and hot metal washed over me, calming my nerves. This was my sanctuary. The walls were lined with tools, each one cleaned and in its proper place. My father had taught me that. A man who can't find his tools, he'd say, is a man who's already lost the battle. My Farmall M stood in the center of the bay. Its paint was faded to a dull, blotchy rose, and the fenders were dented from decades of use. But the engine was perfect. I had rebuilt it myself 2 winters ago, piece by painstaking piece. I knew every gear, every bearing, every seal. When I put a wrench on a bolt on that tractor, it was like shaking hands with an old friend. My father had bought it new in '51. He and my mother had scratched and saved for years to pay cash for it. It was the first brand new tractor they'd ever owned, and on the day he brought it home, he sat me on his knee right there on the shop floor and said something I never forgot. "Jed, my boy, look at this machine. It's ours. No banker can come take it. No bad year can make us lose it. What you own, you control. What you owe controls you." That was the gospel I lived by. Every piece of equipment on my farm, from the John Deere B I used for cultivating to the old New Holland baler, was paid for. My land was clear. The house my grandfather built was mine. In a world that was screaming at farmers to borrow, to expand, to leverage, I was an island of solvency. And for that, men like Rich Davies saw me as a fool. I looked out the big shop door at my fields. The corn was starting to dent. Another few weeks. My combine, the Alice Chalmers All-Crop 66, sat in the implement shed. It was a good machine, simple and reliable, but it was small. A 2-row pull type. It did the job, but it was slow. Against Davies's new self-propelled monster with its 6-row corn head, I was a tortoise racing a hare. The pressure to keep up, to modernize, was immense. The whispers at the co-op, the condescending looks from the implement dealers, the outright mockery from men like Davies. It wore on a man. It planted a seed of doubt in the deepest corners of your mind. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you all, have you ever been in a spot like Jed? Sticking with the old and proven, the thing you own outright, while everyone around you is chasing the new and shiny on-borrowed money? Let me know down in the comments what you would have done in his shoes, because the pressure on this man was immense, and the choices he made would echo for the rest of his life. The harvest of '73 came in hot and dry. Ideal conditions if you had the capacity to take advantage of them. I started the day before dawn, the roar of the Farmall M's C113 engine a familiar comfort in the cool morning air. Hooking up the all-crop was a ritual. I greased the 20-odd zerks, checked the tension on the canvas drapers, and topped off the oil in the main gearbox. The machine was an elegant piece of simple engineering. A sickle bar cut the stalks, which were fed by the drapers into the cylinder. The shelled corn fell through a sieve onto a conveyor that carried it to the small holding tank, while the cobs and trash were spit out the back. Simple, effective, slow. I could manage about 1 acre an hour if things went smoothly. Rich Davies, I'd heard, was knocking down 10 acres an hour with his new machine, sitting in his air-conditioned cab listening to the radio. I was out in the open, eating dust, the sun beating down on my neck. The noise was deafening, a constant mechanical symphony of the tractor's engine, the whir of the PTO shaft, and the clatter and groan of the combine itself. By noon, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my face was caked in a fine layer of black dust. I was on my last pass of the day, with maybe 40 acres done in 3 long days of work, when it happened. There was a high-pitched squeal from the combine, a sound that cut through the normal mechanical chorus like a scream. It was followed by a shudder that I felt through the tractor seat, and then a horrible grinding bang. The whole machine lurched to a stop, the PTO shaft groaning in protest as the engine nearly stalled. I slammed the clutch and killed the power takeoff instantly. Silence. The sudden absence of noise was more alarming than the failure itself. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell of hot, burnt metal drifted up from the combine. I jumped down from the tractor and ran back. Smoke, thin and blue, was curling out from the main cylinder housing. I knew with a sinking certainty that felt like a lead weight in my gut that this was bad. This wasn't a slipped belt or a broken chain. I spent the rest of the daylight hours just getting to the problem. I had to unbolt and remove the heavy sheet metal shrouds, fighting with rusted bolts that hadn't been turned in a decade. Finally, with the guts of the machine exposed, I could see the damage. The main cylinder bearing on the left side had completely disintegrated. The inner race had welded itself to the cylinder shaft, and the outer race had spun inside its housing, chewing up the cast iron until it was oblong and useless. The cylinder itself, a heavy balanced drum of steel with rasp bars bolted to it, was canted at an ugly angle. It was a catastrophe. Rain was in the forecast for the end of the week. Every hour my corn stood in the field now, it was at risk. I didn't have time for a breakdown like this. Back in the shop, I consulted the worn, grease-stained operator's manual. The part number was an old AC code. I got on the phone, the one mounted to the shop wall with the long coiled cord. The local Alice Chalmers dealer, which had since been bought out by a larger conglomerate, was my first call. A young parts man, who sounded like he was barely out of high school, had to look it up in a dusty old book. "Nope, sorry sir, that part's been obsolete for 15 years. We don't carry anything for a machine that old." Same story at the next two dealers I called. They were polite but unhelpful. They were in the business of selling new machines, not keeping old ones running. My only hope was a salvage yard. I called around, casting a wider and wider net until I finally got a hit. A place called Miller & Sons Iron, 100 miles south. The old man who answered the phone knew the machine. "All crop 66? "Oh yeah, got two of them out back in the boneyard. Can't guarantee the condition of the bearings, but you're welcome to come pull one yourself." The next morning, I was on the road before the sun came up, my old Ford pickup loaded with tools, a hydraulic press, and a heavy-duty gear puller. The salvage yard was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of agricultural history. Rusting hulks of tractors and combines sat in silent, crooked rows, weeds growing up through their engine bays. Old Man Miller, a stooped figure with hands like worn leather, pointed me toward the back 40. "They're back by the creek," he grunted. "Watch for snakes." It took me 3 hours of brutal, dirty work under the hot sun. The first combine's bearing was just as shot as mine. The second one was a godsend. It was stiff, but it turned. Using a long breaker bar and a cheater pipe, I managed to get the main nut off the cylinder shaft. Then came the wrestling match, prying and pulling, soaking the whole assembly in penetrating oil until, with a final groaning pop, the bearing and its housing came free. I paid the old man $20 for it, a price that felt like a steal for saving my entire harvest. The drive home was a race against the clock. As I pulled back into my lane, I saw it. Parked on the road, its engine idling with a deep, throaty rumble, was Rich Davis's brand-new combine. He was just finishing the field that bordered mine. He sat high up in his glass-walled cab, watching me. As I drove past, he gave me a slow, pitying shake of his head. He didn't have to say a word. The message was clear. This is what you get for being stubborn. This is what you get for farming with junk. That night, I worked until my body screamed for rest, and then I worked some more. I set up portable floodlights, their harsh glare turning my workshop into an operating theater. The work was precise and unforgiving. I had to press the old, damaged bearing race off my cylinder shaft without galling the steel. I used a torch to heat it, expanding the metal just enough, and with a sharp crack it finally broke loose. Cleaning the shaft, polishing it with emery cloth until it was smooth as glass, then carefully pressing the salvaged bearing assembly into place. It took hours. By 3 a.m., with the new bearing installed and packed with fresh grease, I had the cylinder back in the combine. I was exhausted, my hands were cut and bruised, but as I stood back and looked at the repaired machine, a fierce pride swelled in my chest. I had done it. I hadn't called a dealer. I hadn't paid a mechanic. I had relied on myself. I got the crop out. I finished the last acre just as the first drops of a cold autumn rain began to fall. My yields were good, but my victory felt hollow. At the grain elevator, the talk was all about Rich Davies, how he'd finished his harvest in record time, how he was already doing full tillage with a massive new disc chisel he'd bought. When I'd pull up in my old grain truck, the other farmers would stop talking and just nod at me, their faces a mixture of pity and something that looked like disappointment. They called me Scrap Iron Jed behind my back. I knew it. They saw me as a relic, a man clinging to a bygone era while the world moved on without him. The years that followed were a blur of the same. The mid to late 70s were the boom years. Grain prices, fueled by massive sales to the Soviet Union, shot through the roof. Land values doubled, then tripled. The prevailing wisdom, preached by university experts and eager bankers, was get big or get out. Debt was no longer a dirty word. It was a tool, a necessary lever to pry open the door to prosperity. Rich Davies was the poster child for the new age. He used his ever-inflating land values as collateral to borrow more and more money. He bought another 300 acres from a family that was retiring. He built massive grain bins to store his crop and play the market. He traded in his 1466 for a new International 1086 with all the bells and whistles, and his combine, which was only a few years old, was swapped for a brand new John Deere 7700 Turbo. It was a monster of a machine, with a hydrostatic transmission and a diesel engine that sounded like a freight train. He was hailed as a visionary, a progressive, the future of farming. When he walked into the co-op, people listened. I held my course. The good prices were a blessing, but I saw the frenzy for what it was, a fever. I remembered my father's stories of the Depression, of neighbors who had lost everything because they'd overextended themselves in the good times of the 1920s. So I resisted the siren song of easy credit. I didn't buy more land. Instead, I used my profits to pay off the last of my operating loans and to finally insulate the workshop and install a wood-burning stove so I could work through the winter in comfort. I built up a reserve of cash, a cushion against the unknown. My one big purchase was a used John Deere 4020. I found it sitting on a dealer's backlot, a trade-in that they hadn't even bothered to clean up. It was a 1969 model, a late one with the side console. The engine was tired and it had hydraulic leaks, but the bones were good. I paid $6,000 for it. Cash. The salesman looked at me like I had 3 heads. Everyone financed. Everyone wanted new. I spent that entire winter in my newly heated shop, tearing that 4020 down to the frame. I did a complete in-frame overhaul on the big 6-cylinder diesel engine. New sleeves, pistons, rings and bearings. I rebuilt the hydraulic pump and replaced every single O-ring and seal. I rewired it from front to back. When I was done, I gave it a fresh coat of John Deere green paint. It wasn't new, but it was mine. And it was a world away from the old Farmall M. It had power, a comfortable seat, and a rock-solid power-shift transmission. For me, it was the pinnacle of modern farming. To everyone else, it was just another piece of Jed's junk. I was falling further and further behind in the neighborhood arms race. While they were buying bigger and newer, I was rebuilding the old. I was a throwback, a curiosity. Scrap Iron Jed, the man who farmed with ghosts. One afternoon in the late fall of 1979, I was at the bank depositing the last of my grain checks. The harvest had been good, prices were still strong, and the mood in the county was euphoric. Rich Davies was at the next teller window, signing a thick stack of papers. He was closing the deal on yet another 100 acres. He was laughing with the bank president, Mr. Harris, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. "Just gotta keep expanding, Charles," Davies said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "You gotta spend money to make money. It's the American way." "As long as the prices hold, Richard, you're a genius," Harris said, patting him on the back. As Davies walked out, I finished my transaction. I couldn't help but glance at the large felt letterboard on the wall behind the tellers. It listed the current deposit and loan rates, and I saw something that made a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. For the first time in my life, I saw a number I never thought possible. Under agricultural operating loans, the little white plastic numbers read 12 0%, 12%. I must have stared at it for a long time because the teller, a kind older woman named Mary, leaned forward. "Everything all right, Jed?" "Mary," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "when did it get to 12%? She sighed, a weary, knowing sound. "Last week, honey. They say it's to fight inflation. Paul Volcker, that new fella at the Federal Reserve, they say it might go higher still." I walked out of the bank into the bright, cold afternoon sun. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Farmers were driving new pickups. The stores on Main Street were busy. Everything looked prosperous. Everything felt fine. But as I stood there on that sidewalk, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air crept down my spine. I could hear my father's voice, a faint echo from the past. "Debt is a fair-weather friend, son. It's all smiles when the sun is shining, but it'll drown you in the first storm." And looking at that clear blue sky, I felt the unmistakable, terrifying feeling of the first few drops of a cold, hard rain. The first sign of the coming storm was not in the sky, but on paper. The numbers on the big board at the bank kept creeping up. 12% became 14. 14 jumped to 16. By the spring of 1980, the prime interest rate was a terrifying 20%. It was a number so high it felt like a typo, a fiction. But the monthly statements farmers received were all too real. At the same time, a world away in Afghanistan, political tensions boiled over. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, and just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel plunged to $2. It was a brutal 1-2 punch. The cost of borrowing money skyrocketed while the value of our crop was cut in half. The mood in the county turned sour. The easy confidence of the 70s evaporated like a morning mist. You'd see farmers at the co-op, their faces grim, staring at the ticker tape as if willing the numbers to rise. The talk was no longer about buying new equipment, but about restructuring loans, about how to make it to next year. I saw Rich Davies at the parts counter one morning that summer. He looked different. The crisp seed corn cap was sweat-stained now, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was arguing with the parts man over the price of a set of fuel injectors for his 1086 tractor. He was trying to get them to knock $50 off the price, his voice tight with a stress he couldn't hide. The man who once bought 80 acres with a flick of his finger was now haggling over a maintenance part. The cracks were beginning to show. The real test, however, came that fall. The harvest of 1981 was a wet one. It rained for a week straight in late September, turning the fields into a muddy quagmire. When it finally dried out enough to work, everyone was in a frantic race against time. This was when the big modern machines were supposed to shine, to make up for lost days with their sheer capacity. I was out with my John Deere 4020, pulling the old Alice Chalmers combine through the field. The ground was still soft, and the 4020's big rear tires dug in, but the steady torque of that 6-cylinder diesel just kept pulling. It was slow going, but it was steady. I was making my way down a long pass that bordered Davies's property when I saw it. His massive John Deere 7700 Turbo was sitting dead still in the middle of the field, its unloading auger sticking out like a broken limb. I finished my pass and shut down my tractor at the fence line. I could see Rich standing beside the combine, his hands on his hips, staring at the silent machine. I walked over. "Trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He kicked one of the huge flotation tires, a gesture of pure, helpless frustration. "The whole thing just quit. Hydrostatic drive is gone. Engine's running, but it won't move an inch forward or back. Can't even run the separator." He pointed to a small, blinking red light on the control console inside the cab. "The dealer says it's probably the main hydraulic pump, or maybe the electronic controller. Either way, it's not something you fix with a wrench and a hammer." "When are they coming out?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Coming out? Jed, they've got 6 other machines down with the same problem. Said they might get a man out here by the end of the week. The part, if they can even get one, has to be shipped from Moline. We're looking at a week, maybe 2. 2 weeks, with this weather." He gestured up at the grey, threatening sky. There it was, the fatal flaw in his system. His machine was so complex, so specialized, that he was completely dependent on the dealer. He had traded self-reliance for horsepower, and now, with his crop on the line, he had nothing. He was a king without a kingdom, stranded in a sea of his own ripening corn. I just nodded. Well, good luck, Rich. I walked back to my tractor, climbed into the seat, and fired up the engine. As I pulled away, the steady clatter of my old Alice Chalmers combine seemed to echo across the field, a sound from another time. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't pretty. But it was running, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. The next year, 1982, the floor gave way completely. Land values, which had been the foundation of the mountain of debt everyone had taken on, collapsed. Ground that had sold for $2,000 an acre was now struggling to bring $800. It was a paper catastrophe. Farmers who were leveraged to the hilt suddenly found themselves with loans that were worth more than their entire farms. The bankers, who had been so eager to lend money just a few years before, changed their tune. Mr. Harris's easy smile was replaced with a permanent, worried frown. The friendly pats on the back were gone, replaced by certified letters demanding payment. The foreclosure notices started as a trickle, then became a flood. Every week, the legal section of the county newspaper listed another family farm going up for auction. These weren't retirement sales, they were funerals. You'd see families who had worked the same ground for 100 years, loading their possessions into a U-Haul, their faces etched with a grief that was deeper than any other. The whole county was shrouded in a quiet, desperate panic. The conversations at the diner were hushed, men talking in low tones about interest rates and deficiency judgments, their coffee growing cold in their cups. Because I had no debt, I was insulated from the worst of it. The low grain prices hurt, but my operating costs were a fraction of my neighbors. I didn't have a $5,000 a month payment to the bank. My fuel bill for the 4020 was manageable. When a part broke, I didn't call a dealer, I went to my workshop. My world was small, self-contained, and solvent. The fever had broken, and I was one of the few who hadn't gotten sick. The inevitable finally happened in the spring of 1984. The notice in the paper was stark and brutal. Public auction by order of the First National Bank of Black Hawk County, the property of Richard A. Davies. The listing went on for half a column, detailing the parcels of land, the house, the grain bins, and the full line of late-model equipment. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a fitting sky for the occasion. The crowd was different from the one at the Miller sale a decade earlier. There was no excitement, no greed in the air. People stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces somber. They were here not to celebrate, but to bear witness. They were watching a man's dream die, and they knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it could just as easily be them. Rich Davies stood near the farmhouse, a place he had built with borrowed money, looking like a ghost. His wife was beside him, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. He had aged 20 years in the last 3. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He looked out at the rows of his beautiful modern machinery parked in a line for the auctioneer. The big John Deere 7700 combine, the massive 1086 tractor, the planters, the discs. They were all there. They weren't gleaming anymore. A fine layer of dust covered them, a testament to a season of idleness. I watched as the banker, Mr. Harris, conferred with the auctioneer. He looked haggard, his suit rumpled. This wasn't a victory for him either. The bank didn't want the land or the iron, they wanted the money, and they knew they would never recoup their losses today. The bidding was slow, pathetic. A planter that Davies had paid $30,000 for sold for $6,000. His 1086 tractor, with less than 2,000 hours on it, went for a third of its original price. The buyers were mostly out-of-state investment groups and a few large operators from other counties who had weathered the storm better. They were picking over the bones. When the auctioneer got to the John Deere 7700 combine, the one that had sat broken in the field, a hush fell over the crowd. It was the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It represented the promise of technology, the allure of progress, the dream of effortless abundance, and it had failed. "All right, folks, here she is, the top of the line in her day," the auctioneer chanted, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "What am I bid for this John Deere 7700 Turbo?" Needs a little work on the hydraulics, I'm told, but it's a low-hour machine. The bidding started low and stayed there. It was a complex machine that required expensive repairs, and nobody had the cash or the stomach for it. It finally sold for $12,000 to a salvage dealer from Missouri. $12,000 for a machine that had cost over $100,000 just a few years before. I saw Rich flinch when the gavel fell, as if he'd been physically struck. I stayed through it all, a silent observer. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to learn, to remember. I was watching the physical manifestation of my father's wisdom. What you owe controls you. Richard Davies had been controlled, and now he had been consumed. He had chased the dream of modern farming right off a cliff, and the wreckage was laid out for all to see. The man who had mocked my old iron had been destroyed by his new iron. The last items to be sold were the parcels of land. The auctioneer moved from tract to tract, his voice droning on, selling off a man's life piece by piece. Finally, they came to the last one. Lot number 7, folks, 80 acres more or less. Prime black dirt, lays flat, tiled well. Borders the stone farm to the east. It was the Miller place, the land my father had always wanted. The land that had been the start of Rich Davies's meteoric rise and the beginning of my quiet defiance. My heart started to pound in my chest, a slow, heavy drumbeat. This was the moment, the culmination of a decade of hard work, of saving, of staying the course while everyone else was running a different race. The auctioneer started the bidding. Who'll give me $500 an acre? 500? Do I hear 5? Hands stayed in pockets. The investment buyers had already gotten what they wanted. The local farmers were broke. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Come on, folks, this is the best piece of ground in the county. 500 is a steal, the auctioneer pleaded. I raised my hand, not a flick of a finger like Davies had done, a full, steady raising of my arm. My voice was clear and strong when I spoke. 500. A murmur went through the crowd, heads turned, scrap iron Jed. They looked at me with a new understanding, a dawning respect. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I got 500 from Mr. Stone, now 6. Will you give me 600? Silence. No one else was going to bid. They couldn't. 500 going once. Twice. I looked over at Rich Davies. He was staring at me, his face a mixture of disbelief, defeat, and something else. Maybe a flicker of comprehension. He finally understood. He finally saw the power in not owing anyone anything. Sold for $500 an acre to Jedediah Stone. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the entire farmstead. I walked over to the clerk's table, my legs feeling strangely light. Mr. Harris, the banker, was standing there, his face pale. "How will you be handling the financing, Jed?" he asked, his voice tired. I pulled the worn checkbook from my inside coat pocket. It was the same one my father had used. I uncapped my pen, wrote out the full amount for the $40,000 and signed my name at the bottom. I tore the check out and handed it to him. "I'll be paying cash," I said. His eyes widened as he looked at the check, then back at me. In that moment, the world had been turned right side down. The man with the old iron was buying the land, and the man with the new iron had lost it all. My father's dream was finally realized, not through leverage and risk, but through patience and prudence. After the crowd had dispersed and the last of the buyers were loading up their grim purchases, I saw Rich standing alone by the empty machine shed. He was just staring out at the fields he no longer owned. I walked over and stood beside him for a moment. We didn't speak. The grey sky and the damp wind did the talking for us. "I'm sorry it came to this, Rich," I said finally. He shook his head, not looking at me. "Don't be. You were right. I couldn't see it." He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were clear for the first time in years. The frantic, hunted look was gone. In its place was a profound and weary sadness. "My dad told me the same things your dad told you. I thought he was an old fool. Called it depression thinking. I thought I was smarter." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out I was the fool all along." "What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know. Find a job in town, I guess. We lost the house, everything. We're moving in with her folks." He looked down at his hands, hands that were soft from years of sitting in a climate-controlled cab. I don't know how to do anything else. An idea came to me then, unbidden. It wasn't about pity. It was about decency. I'll be needing a hand this fall, I said. That new 80 is going to stretch me thin. I could use someone who knows how to run a combine. He looked up, surprised. Your combine? That old Alice? She's not much to look at, I said with a small smile, but she's paid for, and she runs. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The 80s were lean years for everyone, but we survived. Rich came to work for me that fall, and the fall after that. It was awkward at first, but we found a strange sort of peace working together. He taught me a few things about new seed hybrids, and I taught him how to rebuild a carburetor and weld a broken axle. The nickname Scrap Iron Jed faded away. People just called me Jed. They'd stop by my workshop now, not to look at the museum pieces, but to ask for help. Jed, my old 4010 is acting up. Can you take a look? Jed, do you know where I can find a water pump for a bee? My shop, once a symbol of my stubbornness, became a lifeline for a community trying to keep its old iron running because nobody could afford new. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed. I never got big. I was content with my 240 acres. It was enough. I eventually bought a slightly newer combine, a used John Deere 6600, but I paid cash for it. And I kept the old Alice Chalmers, parking it in the back of the shed like a retired champion. One cool evening in the early 90s, my son, Daniel, who was then about 16, was in the shop with me. He was watching me tinker with the engine on the old Farmall M, the first tractor my father had bought new. Dad, he said, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek, why do you keep this old thing? It's ancient. We've got the 4020. I stopped turning the wrench and looked at him. I saw the same look in his eyes that I'd seen in Rich Davis's eyes all those years ago. The impatience of youth, the belief that newer is always better. I smiled. I wiped my hands on a rag and put my arm around his shoulder. I led him to the big shop door and we looked out at the fields, dark and resting under a blanket of stars. The 80 acres I had bought at the auction lay directly in front of us, a dark, fertile patch of promise. Daniel, I said, my voice quiet, that tractor isn't just a machine. It's a story. It's a lesson. It represents a promise your grandfather made to himself, to never let a banker decide if he could farm or not. I pointed out toward the land. That field over there belonged to a man who had the newest, biggest, and best of everything. He had more horsepower than anyone in this county, but he didn't own it. It owned him. This old tractor, I said, patting its faded red fender, taught me that the most important tool on a farm isn't in the machine shed. It's in your head. It's the wisdom to know the difference between what you want and what you need. It's the discipline to live within your means. He was quiet for a long time, just looking out at the land, the same land his great-grandfather had dreamed of. I could see the gears turning in his young mind, connecting the past to the present. What you own, you control, he said softly, repeating the words he'd heard me say 100 times. And what you owe, I finished, controls you. I switched off the shop lights, and we stood there for another moment in the comfortable darkness. The cool night air smelled of damp earth and diesel fuel, and the faint, sweet scent of cut hay from the loft above. The honest smells of a life built not on credit, but on character. And I knew, with a deep and abiding peace, that the lesson had been passed on. The legacy was safe.